Good afternoon. First and foremost, thank you all for finding the time to make your way back into the stage after the lunch break, which seems to also still be going on. But thank you for coming to listen to this wonderful panel that I'm very much looking forward to. My name's Madeleine. I'm Director of Programs and Innovation at Global Digital Finance, and it's my pleasure to open this panel with not one, but two, but three of GDS partners. So thank you all for joining me, and can I just ask you to kick off by introducing yourselves? Alex, why don't we start with you?
So good afternoon, Alexandre Kech, newly appointed CEO of the GLEIF, Global LEI Foundation. So the GLEIF was created by the Financial Stability Board after the 2008 financial crisis as an organization that orchestrates the issuance of legal entity identifiers to companies around the world for the simple purpose of identifying companies, ensuring that KYC is done properly, that risk is reduced because you have a clear visibility on who you're dealing with as a counterparty.
Hi all, my name is Denis Dounaev. I am the product owner at the DTI Foundation. We are the registration authority for the ISO standard for DTI, which was set up to uniquely identify all digital assets.
Good afternoon, everyone. Stephan Dreyer, Managing Director at ANA, which is the Association of National Numbering Agencies. So we are an association global in nature, 120 members, been working in the financial standards space for the last 30 years. And we are responsible for the implementation and maintenance of the International Securities Identification Number, or ISIN code. And the last several years, we've been working very diligently on expanding the influence and application of ISIN and other financial standards to the digital asset industry.
Super. Well, if that's a segue to get us started, if any of you have attended EBC before, you might know that ANA and DTIF have been sort of flagship partners of the conference for several years now. It's where I've got to know both of you. And so maybe for those who are not familiar with that, can you maybe just walk us through some of the work that ANA you're doing to integrate into the digital asset world and what that collaboration looks like?
Yep. When DTI Foundation was created, that was around the time, or the DTI standard was being developed. ANA was very heavily involved within the ISO community in the development of the DTI standard. So there was always a vision for how the two standards would work together in a complementary nature. And one of the first steps was establishing a task force between the two organizations to really look at how an ISIN code, which is an identifier that works at the asset level. So if you think, Tether, Bitcoin, KFW digital bond, that is the asset. And then the DTI, which is implemented at the token level, how those things would work together in a complementary nature and be interoperable. And so we started on that journey. As we start seeing more issuances of digital securities, we've been working very closely in addition to our natural processes for ISIN obtaining ISINs, procuring DTIs. Dennis can elaborate a little bit more on the use cases for DTI. But also looking at making sure other crypto assets, these new things that are coming native to blockchains, are also being identified at the asset level. And then there are multiple digital implementations by the DTI.
So I think I'll kind of start maybe clear up some kind of terms. So when we talk about ISO standards, ISO as an organization has, hundreds of thousands of different standards. What we are, all three of us, are representing organizations that are maintaining the registrations for identifiers. So this is not something you become kind of compliant with a particular standard. This is the unique identification of a particular thing. So when we look at how ISIN and DTI are complementary in nature, ISIN does thing really well, which is identifying the asset. It's been around for 40 years. It's used by regulators. It's used by the industry. But with the digital tokens, there is an additional element of where that token is implemented. So like Stephan mentioned, like Tether as an example, or Circle, could be implemented on multiple blockchains. It's still the same asset, but it exists as a different token. So On the DTI side, we take the technical information of the standard implementation, group them together under the same asset umbrella, and then link it to the ISIN created by Anna. So what we then have is the technical information of the token represented by DTIs and the asset or economic attributes of the asset represented by ISIN. And we've been looking at the traditional financial assets, and we have quite a few of them already in the registry, but we've also been looking at the more traditional crypto assets like stable coins or Bitcoin, even some meme coins. I think
that covers it.
covers
Well,
it.
thank you both. And Alex, GLEIF is an association that has started in traditional finance essentially and is now moving into the digital asset space. Can you walk us through sort of that journey a little bit and where you see GLEIF really sort of coming into its own, so to speak, in the digital asset space?
Sure. So initially, the Global LEI Foundation was created as a non-for-profit public good at the end of the day to benefit the financial industry. It started with OTC derivative. So how do you identify counterparties to OTC derivative transactions? How do you report those transactions to trade repository? And then it progressively moved to other use cases of legal entity identification. For example, cross-border payments. How do I identify payer and payee in a cross-border payment when it's a corporate-to-corporate payment? It also evolved into supply chain to identify the various parties involved in supply chain. So it's really kind of a passport that can be used for multi-purposes. The same way that you use your passport to travel to another country, you can also use it to KYC yourself into a bank, to open a bank account. That's the same approach but for legal entities. So how does it touch the digital asset space? Well, interestingly, it started with a bunch of people defining a standard for the travel rule called IVMS 101. So that GDF was involved in that. So it was a industry group looking at how can we transfer beneficiary and ordering customer information to comply with the travel rule in the crypto world in the most efficient way. And LEI, Legal Entity Identifier, was identified as a good standard for identifying virtual asset service providers and their customers when they are corporate. It then evolved into regulations with MiCA, for example, also suggesting that when you are a token issuer or crypto asset service provider and you have an LEI, you should use your LEI to identify yourself when you report to the regulator or when you issue a prospectus or white paper, for example. So that's the link, because obviously you have the asset identification requirements in the world of regulation. You have the technical requirements of where this asset sits on what blockchain, and then you have who issued that asset, and that's really where the LEI is interesting. It identifies the issuer of the token or the ISIN in case, and we have this strong collaboration with Anna and soon with DTIF on what we call mapping LEI and ISIN or LEI and DTI information to ensure that there's always this ease of use and actually database management using all those ISO standards that we respectively representing here on the topic. Maybe a last point. So LEI is an analog solution in a way, so it's not like a DID and verifiable credential system. We've created on top of the LEI a distributed identity and verifiable credential system for legal entities that enables companies to identify themselves on any platform. It's blockchain agnostic, but also individuals working for that company to provably, verifiably identify themselves on blockchain services. So it could be relevant, for example, to link the issuer of a smart contract to that legal entity in a verifiable way. So let's say that it's a company issuing a securities token. You could verifiably ensure that that token you see on the blockchain is effectively the token issued by that company. The same for services. If you go on Uniswap, for example, you better make sure that you are on the right Uniswap, and if been attempt to impersonate Uniswap and you go there and you put your tokens on it and it's not Uniswap. So that's also a way, a possibility to use the VLEI, verifiable LEI, to do that, to link that smart contract service to the real company behind that smart contract. And finally, it's also very usable and very strong in permissioning actors into blockchain services. So allowing, for example, an exchange permissioning those 5 corporates to connect to the service and start doing business in a verifiable way. So we can discuss a bit more about that later, but it has evolved. Standards always evolve to adapt to the needs of the industry, whatever the technology. And this, we have 3 examples of standards evolving to support the industry as much as possible.
Yeah, we really do, and I mean, it's something that I enjoy so much. It's this calibration point every time we come to EBC, and we just stay in touch as to how those standards are evolving. And so maybe actually on that, can Stephan and Denis, you want to talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing in terms of collaborating with regulators to see how DTIs can integrate into some of the regulatory frameworks that we're seeing emerge, like MiCA, for example?
Yeah, so taking MiCA as an example, we had multiple meetings and participated in kind of in the working groups, explaining why DTI is needed, and now on the MiCA, the DTI is required when you're doing a white paper for arts and EMTs, and also all the CASPs have to use DTIs when doing regulatory reporting. So I think what regulators kind of find is that the use of the ISO standards like LEI and ISIN and DTI are beneficial, not just as a regulatory thing, but also as a as just identification of these of the right product or organization. We also see other jurisdictions globally looking at the identification, and again, these standards being ISO, they're looking at things like LEI and DTI and ISIN.
Anything to add?
I think it's important. So we talk about the regulation, and that is something that obviously all of us work on very heavily, is working with regulators, getting them to understand the benefits and integrate identification standards, in particular the ISO standards, into securities and crypto regulations more broadly. But I think the other aspect is going and speaking to industry and talking about the benefits of standards outside of regulatory mandates. And that's another significant aspect where we all invest a lot of time. So you wonder, you've got this ISIN thing that identifies, some asset you've just said, and you've got then a DTI, which identifies the token, and then you've got the LEI, which is identifying this entity, and it sounds all very complex and a lot of work and a lot of effort. But I think it's important that people understand the use cases. Obviously, if the regulators expect that reporting is done against certain standard identifiers, then if you're a regulated entity or looking to operate in regulated markets, you're going to have to comply with that. But as a business, you're going to benefit also. And so we're all very involved in the promotion of the adoption and implementation of standards, even in the absence of regulatory mandates. And you look at things like data management, you look at risk management, compliance. All of these are different aspects of the business that can benefit from standards, and particular standards which are interoperable and complementary and free.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly what I wanted to get into, right? And it's doing justice to the title of the panel, which is building bridges between TradFi, or traditional assets and digital assets, which comes with standards. It's standards that foster that trust between market participants, regulators, and policymakers at that in new markets. And so, I mean, can you maybe give some more examples of what those use cases are and to where standards play that role in terms of building bridges between TradFi and digital assets? Alex, I don't know if you want to start with some use cases.
Well, it's all about proper data management. So I used to work at Six Digital Exchange, which is an exchange that issues bonds in tokenized form and settles against central bank digital currency. It's just logical as a financial institution who is traditional and moving into digital assets to reuse as much as possible existing standards. There's no need to have a new type of identifier for instrument, for legal entities, for tokens. We needed one because there was none, and that's why we created the DTI. But there's no need to reinvent the wheel when existing standards have proven that they are meeting the objective of what they've built for and can be reapplied. So when we were at SDX, when we were onboarding customers, we would ask their LEI. It was the primary key for onboarding any banks or any financial institutions or corporates wanting to use our service. They must have an LEI, legal entity identifier. And when we issue bonds, we obviously we asked for a DTI that is linked to the bond, and the bond also had an ISIN, obviously, as well, because that's how the asset is identified. So whether the instrument is tokenized or not tokenized, it needs an identifier. Whether the company is a blockchain company or a newcomer or a traditional player, they need a legal entity identifier. So reusing those standards enable that bridging, and that because ultimately this will be the same thing. TradFi and DeFi will be finance, and ultimately. So I think we are contributing to the acceleration of adoption of those technologies, because we enable traditional players to easily or more easily get into digital assets, reusing standards that they know, cherish, and use on a day-to-day basis.
And well, Denis, go ahead, please.
Yep. So just in another use case where DTI has been recently started to be picked up is in derivatives. So if you have a contract against a digital asset, you can use the name, and we've seen examples of people saying Solana, which is fine if your counterparty is trustworthy or there is an implicit understanding what Solana actually means. But anybody here can create a smart contract, call it Solana on Ethereum. Is that the Solana that you meant, or is it a different Solana? Is this the token that's been maybe perhaps bridged from Solana blockchain? So it kind of becomes difficult with the just using words or names of the tokens. So we've seen a couple of derivatives contracts being created with the DTI in a white paper to uniquely identify the digital token.
So I just want to backtrack, and I'm going to oversimplify a little bit. I think every day in our lives we are confronted with situations where standards are at play. There are things that happen. I'll give an example in a second. But if we think about these digital assets, there's this thing that is being created, right? Call it a digital bond, call it a cryptocurrency, call it a stable coin, whatever. Somebody's created a thing. So that thing is being identified by an ISIN. At the top of that, you want to know, well, who created that thing? There's an issuer or an organization behind that. And that is what the LEI is doing. Then that thing, there are digital representations that exist on different, potentially, networks. So that is what the DTI is doing. So when you think about the use cases, and I just like to use this car example. You can analogous to a car manufacturer, right? You've got a company. Let's take Volkswagen, even though they're probably not doing so well at the moment. But you've got Volkswagen as a company. That is the entity, the thing that is creating things. And Volkswagen has lots of different brands, Golf, Jetta, et cetera, and then within that portfolio, you even got, if you want to take it to the extreme, the Audi and the Porsche, Skodas. Those are the assets, right? So, and then you have the actual vehicles that are being manufactured in different locations, in different factories around the world. That is the actual implementation. And so that is kind of the level of the DTI. So you've got LEI, entity, ISIN, asset, and DTI at the implementation, the token level. And each one of those is complementary in nature. They have a different set of reference data that serve a different purpose. So just going back to what I was saying before, data management. Most firms in an ecosystem, in capital markets or financial services, have to transmit information, right? If I'm the issuer, I'm an underwriter, the custody, whatever, the exchange, the investor, and they do that against a key, right? So that information is transmitted against an identifier through a machine so that we know that we're talking about exactly the same thing. And again, that information is then complemented with other identifiers to give them the full picture. So there's the data management aspect. The other one that I like to talk about is your risk. So assessing your risk. Because if you've got a very diversified portfolio and you've got traditional assets in there, you may have direct investments in Bitcoin, and then you may have derivatives. So ETPs on Bitcoin, and you want to be able to understand what your exposure is to anything, irrespective of how or what form that is. So then you can do that against identifiers.
I mean, that's such an interesting use case, but also like bringing it back to sort of the examples that everybody hopefully in the room can recognize is very helpful. But I'll wrap that up on, ladies and gentlemen, this is the holy trinity of standards when it comes to this space. And I think, I mean, the mapping that Stephan just gave us was, at least for me, very helpful. So thank you. I want to talk a little bit about, again, this sort of journey from TradFi into digital assets, and I suppose the building of the bridges. In the building of the bridges, if we're using real world analogs, what hiccups have you run into? Where have you sort of run into challenges in terms of building the interoperability that we need between traditional finance and digital assets when it comes to standards development? So obviously from the GLEIF perspective, I'm sure you have insights there, and Anna too, so I'll leave it to you to decide who goes first.
Well, there always are challenges. I think the challenges of standards in a new industry is to get that standards known, really, at the end of the day. And that's why we're here on the stage today. And by the way, if you look at the gleif.org website and you look at search, I'm pretty sure that 80% of the companies, even if you are a startup in this room, have already an LEI, because you need it for some specific requirements, either as an onboarding for a bank requirement, or because you're already reporting to regulators or because you're doing payments, and LEIs are necessary for that. And I advise you to look at the GLEIF and see whether you have an LEI, and if you don't have one, go and apply for it. It's very economical. The data is enabled for free it's published for free and accessible for free for consumption, and it's really something that you should grab and use and leverage as you build your own business as well, internally, your own data architecture. So the challenge is about getting to know, getting those new players in the industry to know about existing standards and avoid the reinventing of the wheel, as I was saying earlier, where people come up with a new standard that already exists. And why? It doesn't need to be so. So reuse existing standards. They are free because they are open source in general, and they can be applied to the blockchain industry and digital asset industry.
So I would, in terms of challenges, I would say that the main one is education and awareness, because there are a lot of people that are not aware of standards, and obviously with the birth of DLT and blockchain, you had a whole new community that came out, and we're not aware of all the things that were being done in TradFi. And the TradFi guys, they didn't know what was being done in DLT and blockchain. And so that's kind of our mission here, to go out and make sure that there is awareness. I think it's getting easier because there is much more of a convergence between these two things. I think a lot of people, believe, okay, standards, complex, difficult, costly to implement, all of these kind of and then I'll wait until the regulators say I have to do it. And as I said before, there's a lot of benefits to be achieved in terms of being an early adopter. And we don't, develop these standards in isolation. They're done within industry expert communities, within ISO, leveraging feedback from market participants. And so being able, being an early adopter allows you to get in there and help develop or influence the development of the standards. I would say the second thing, and where we've had a benefit, so lessons learned in setting out in the journey between mapping ISINs and DTIs, we learned a little bit from the experience that we had with ISIN and LEI, where we had two standards that kind of evolved independently of each other. And then ultimately, the two organizations came together and said, it would be a huge benefit to the industry and the market if we brought these things together for them. So the ISIN and the LEI, so the mapping initiative that Alex referred to. But doing things in retrospect is always a bit more challenging. Large data sets, the validations and whatnot but I think we've gotten to a good point. LEI is a mandatory data element within the ISO 6166 ISIN standard now. So if something has an LEI, if an issuer has an LEI, it is required to be included as part of the ISIN record, which is a huge step forward, I think.
Absolutely. And Denis, do you have anything to add maybe from I suppose, the tech native side of this, if we're looking at the at least history of the organizations, if you're meeting Anna and LEI on the other side of the bridge, so to speak, again, what challenges has DTI sort of seen in the past few years in this respect?
I think probably the biggest challenge is the speed of innovation within the DLT space. And it has two different kind of thing. One is that the market participants and regulators are trying to learn about this new place and try to understand what measures they need to put in place to protect the investors. And I think part of that was what Stephan said, is that we had to kind of go around and kind of talk about the standards, how they can be used, and also to sometimes educate regulators around yes, there are massive advantages to using DLTs for traditional securities and crypto, but there are also massive risks, including governance of the DLTs. So that's kind of one outcome from that challenge. The second outcome is really making sure that the standards are still supporting the market as the technology evolves. And what we have, because these are ISO standards, they have strong governance. So there is a group that regularly reviews these and then provides updates on them if needed, if something has changed or something that's, I guess, needs to be cleared up. So when the DTI standard went live in 21, I think, September 21, we actually gave some feedback back to ISO to ensure that certain things are tweaked in the standard, and that's now going for the final ballot. So I think having that process in place to update the standards is extremely helpful, because technology is not gonna stop.
Maybe to add one challenge that we currently having with the legal entity identifier is that how do you identify a decentralized autonomous organization? Because it's not technically a legal entity, although in some countries like Bahamas and I think Switzerland, they are looking at a legal construct to register decentralized autonomous organization. And if that goes through, they would be liable, well, not liable, they would be able to get an LEI, but we haven't solved that problem yet. But that's something we're looking at, because I think it's important that any issuer of tokens or any entities, whatever the legal form, or even if it doesn't have a formal legal form, should be identified, because it's useful for the security of the system itself and for the growth of this industry in general.
Yeah, and so maybe actually I'm conscientious that I shouldn't be jumping in as a panelist here, but there's another standards geek here. There's a really interesting concept of lemas in French law that essentially allows for that. I can't take credit for it. This was from a chat with a gentleman at Société Générale who essentially explained that there's an attribution of lemas where you can represent nebulous entities through French structures, which allows at least SocGen at the moment to do a lot of the work that they're doing with their stablecoin, with DeFi entities and so on. But we can take that, we can take the side. I think there's a lot of food for thought here right now, and I think I just want to sort of pivot to what we're looking at, what we're building. I think, Stephan, you mentioned the word convergence, which is probably one of my favorite topics, is what's the landscape looking like as we build the bridges between TradFi and digital assets. So maybe if I start with you, I think not on the green shoots, but what are you hoping that we see in terms of regulatory developments that where we're looking at integration with the standards that we have here today? What are you hoping for will facilitate this continuous building between TradFi and digital assets, at least in the short-term future, before we next meet at EBC?
Yeah, well, I think what we are obviously seeing is a lot of progress of firms moving out of POCs into pilots, right? So I think we're very much into a pilot phase, whether that's on digital securities. We're starting to see some shares, and I think obviously in terms of crypto derivatives, you've got the tokenized money market funds is a big theme. You've got things going on with carbon credits. So I think there is definitely progress being made. I think you'll also start seeing a lot more of institutional stablecoins, like SG has done. I think that will be a thing. So I think over time, in the long term, we'll see some consolidation in the stablecoin space. I'm not sure if industry needs that many stablecoins, but that's just my personal view. But I think what I am finding is that there is a lot more of tri-party dialogue. So you have technology and standards bodies and regulators all coming together much more frequently in various different forums. Associations like GDF facilitating a lot of that work, bringing different industry participants together. And I think that's super, super important. There is still a lot of work to do. You may have noticed when we've talked about standards, we focus very much on the identification aspects of very specific things. So it's just a niche in this bigger standards space. You have a lot of other standards that need to be looked at and will come up for discussion, public versus private and technology standards, tokenization platform standards. So there's, the standard space is much bigger than what we're actually talking about here. And certainly for us here, I know that one of the big ticket items in the book of work, and it's probably, it almost seems a little bit cart before the horse, or whatever the analogy is the kind of taxonomy and classification, because that is a key ingredient, I think, for the further evolution of regulation, right? So defining the things that we're talking about. We do still find that a lot of terms, whether they're just wrappers or marketing terms for things, or whether they're actual legal definitions, are very inconsistent across jurisdictions. I know I probably talk about the same thing with 5 different words in one sentence. So there's still a lot of work to be done there, and there are standards within the ISO space that can be leveraged for that purpose, and we will look to take a look at those in the future. But I think getting this identification piece out of the way, or at least to an advanced stage, is super important, because it allows us to be certain about the thing that we're talking about. When we say, how are we going to define that, we know that we're talking about the same thing because we've got identifiers for it.
Anything to add?
That's quite a lot there. Covered all the. I just want I think convergence of the taxonomy is really important, and I think we talked about this kind of every year. What is a stable coin? Who has the right to say it's a stable coin? There is definition under MiCA. There is, I guess, every jurisdiction will have its own sort of view on that. So it becomes kind of problematic from the investor perspective, especially if you have multi-region sort of options. So I think that convergence, I think it's not going to be next year. It's longer term, but I think it's going to kind of move in that direction. But I think the other thing to help the industry with the transition, I think, was something we mentioned before, and that's kind of reuse of existing standards and standards and also channels that traditional finance has been using for years. Like, for example, FIX. FIX has been around for a long time. It works really well. It's been kind of at the heart of the financial industry. So when there was some kind of discussion about how do we connect a blockchain to traditional finance, I think initially it was kind of viewed to build something new. But then somebody said, look, it already exists. Traditional finance is able to connect to it, and it works. You've been involved in a pilot. So I think, yes, innovation in this space is great, and it's great to see some kind of interesting things out there. But I think for crypto market participants, it's good to know that there are already things that exist that could be easily used, and not only that they work already, so there's less time to market, but also make it easier for traditional finance to access these new technologies or exchanges.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take away from Alex's moment, but I'm also very glad that you used the fix example because that's a lot of the work that GDF has been doing as of late in our tokenization forum. We're testing out the integration of fixed trading community into the world of digital assets using the FinP2P protocol. And so that's like a real life example at the moment of how we're testing that integration. And it's true. I mean, it facilitates that scalability from institutional perspective because it's something that we know, it's something that we recognize, it's something that we trust. And so, yes, to not reinventing the wheel, but Alex, please.
Well, I can concur by a real live example. So Six Digital Exchange, again, the trading of the tokenized bonds and tokenized equities is done via fix because there's no need to change this broker to exchange connectivity if it works. How it settles on blockchains later, that's something different. And it's obviously happening on the blockchain. But in terms of communication channel between brokers and the exchange itself, they are reusing the fixed standard. And for the settlement bit, they are also reusing the ISO 20022 standards, which is the standards used for post-trade activities in securities and in payments. So no need to change something that works. Focus on the core value of blockchain, which is transfer of value and holdership of value, and make it as efficient as possible, leveraging existing standards, while at the same time being innovative on the way the settlement process itself is happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so I think that there's a lot there in terms of what we need to be paying attention to. The one last thing that I want to really hone in on is, I suppose we've all spoken about how important it is to collaborate with regulators and policymakers and try and ensure that these standards are essentially, filter into regulatory frameworks within the digital asset space. But what's needed from a market participant perspective beyond checking the GLEIF website to see if they have a LEI? Like, how can we foster better collaboration with market participants to ensure the better utility, I suppose, of these standards? Because that's something that I'm always like, I don't want to say obsessed with, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about this, is if we have these standards, how can we ensure that they derive utility? We have a standard that we've published for FI, so we're working a lot with the ACI FMA right now, trying to think about a attestation model for this and so on, because it's all very well bringing a standard to market, but how is it then used? So any perspective on that would be wonderful.
Maybe one point. So in the LEI world, we have a concept called validation agents. So these would be, for example, a bank that onboard a corporate on regular basis and do a KYC, a very stringent KYC, as you know, to onboard that legal entity as a customer. So we leverage that process to also ask for an LEI if that company doesn't have an LEI. The same is happening in the crypto space. So we have a validation agent called Verify VASP. They might be in the room, and they are certainly in the audience because I've seen them around. So Verify VASP is a validation agent that issues LEI to crypto asset service provider or virtual asset service provider when they onboard on their platform and they don't have an LEI because they know that LEI is important for them. They sponsor the cost of issuance of LEI, which is $50. It's not a lot of money. And they enable that their customer at the end of the day to get an LEI and be, let's say, and enter the standardization world in a most convenient way. So these type of partnership are important to us, and that's what we're also doing. Anybody who does onboarding of legal entities as part of their business, if you're interested to talk to me after as becoming a validation agent, we can definitely involve you into the process. Everything we do is pretty much open source, so it's all about collaboration. It's all about partnership. I don't sell anything, as I always say. I'm giving I'm making available a protocol and a standard to enable many things at companies, but it cannot only work if those companies onboard and use that standard, and if we have partners that enable the technical support required to manage that standard.
I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I don't sell anything either. All I do is say we have these incredible standards organizations in our association as partners that we're very proud of. So, they're there to be used and to explore collaboration avenues. But Stephan, Denis, I don't know if you have anything to add on that front.
Completely agree with what Alex is saying. That I think you kind of just step back. When we speak about the standards, we usually meet kind of two responses. One is probably more from traditional finance, who is saying, of course we need this. you know, ICE and DTI, LEI, really, really important. It's important that we have that not only for our regulatory mandate, but also that to ensure we have the right counterparty and we're selling the right product. The other response we get is usually like, why? You know, this product, this DLT, this blockchain already has a smart contract address. That's a unique identification. Why would I need anything else? And that's, I guess that's fine if you're never going to interact outside that blockchain. As soon as you connect to another blockchain or connect to regulator or connect to exchange, you need some sort of standard. So, and even kind of pushing back from the standard, things like BTC, ETH became default standards, but they're not unique. So, you know, we kind of, what we're advising the industry is to pick up these standards that are unique, that are useful. And if you find something that's not useful or that can be improved in some way, come and speak to us. These standards evolve. There is a process under ISO that can review them every couple of years. But also as registration authorities or I think we're all registration authorities or maintenance authorities, we can make certain changes, not to the standard itself, but for example, add additional data attribute or classify something, you know, instead of integer should be a string or something like that. We are here to help the industry. If it's in any way can be improved, speak to us, let us know. We can see if that can be done.
I'll just add to that, the maximum value that can be achieved from the standards is when you have the maximum number of participants using that. If I have a standard and I'm the only one using it, it has zero value, right? So that adoption across the industry is super important for us, and that's why we invest so much time in raising that level of awareness. If we can get more people talking the same language, using the same standards to talk about or transmit data or perform their operational functions, then everybody's going to benefit from that, right? Because it's going to make the processing, the operations much more efficient and inexpensive. Things won't have to be done, you know, back offices reconciling different trades and all that kind of stuff that happens in TradFi. When you have the standards, you have much better data sources at your hand. And I would say, you know, it depends on what your role is in this whole ecosystem. If you are an issuer of something, your needs are going to be a little bit different in terms of wanting to approach any of the organizations here about obtaining the identifier for the thing that you're issuing. But our plea goes out, you know, to the type of organizations that are very well represented here at this event, who are in other aspects of that, whether it's research or data vendors or you know, crypto exchanges, custody, whatever it is that you're doing. Think about building a product and integrating the standards into it already. At least have the field so your clients have it when the needs arise. Again, don't wait until the regulatory mandates are there. You can build it now.
Because ultimately that's really where this scales, I think. And I mean, I say that a lot in terms of when we're looking at institutional adoption in this space, it's a question of volume too. And I think from the standards perspective, that rhetoric fits as well. It's about creating that network effect so that it actually makes sense to use the standards because other people are using it and otherwise you don't have that utility. So, I mean, it's great to see the fantastic work that all three organizations have been doing since, you know, I mean, I want to say the beginning of standards and digital assets. So thank you for sharing your insights today with everybody. And I hope that you found it useful unpicking sort of the different layers of standards that we have here today. And if you have any questions for the panelists, I'm sure they'll be around after. So thank you very much, and a round of applause, please.